Hello and welcome to LionWing Talks, a show where we discuss all things LionWing, tabletop games, Japanese games, and localization. I'm Bradley Hailstorm, founder and president of LionWing Publishing. This is episode 37 of LionWing Talks for October 17th, 2024. This is a very special episode of LionWing Talks, not just because it's the first one I've done in 6 months. I promise I'll try to get to these things a little bit sooner, but so far my track record has been once every 6 months, so I apologize in advance. But why we are here tonight and why it's so special is because I'm not alone for once. In fact, I have a very special guest with me tonight. I have the author and designer of Shin Megami Tensei, the role-playing game, Tokyo Conception, and many of the other unlocalized Shin Megami Tensei role-playing game books, Tokita Yusuke. I will be talking with him tonight, asking him a whole lot of questions, and we're going to be diving into what it was like to develop Tokyo Conception. I have kind of separated this interview into two halves. The first set of questions, the first half of the interview will be focused on Tokita-san himself, what got him into the industry in questions like that. And then the back half of the interview will be all about Tokyo Conception and diving into that. So Tokita-san has been kind enough to give me 2 hours tonight. I have 26 questions written down, but I have a bad habit of putting like 3 questions into 1 question. So I really have about 45 questions. And I'm telling you that because some of my transitions and segues between questions might be a little abrupt, but that's by design. I'm trying to hit my time marks and get through as many questions as possible just because I have so much to ask Tokita-san. So that is how tonight will go. And I'm just going to jump into things now because you all want to hear from Tokita-san, not me. So, Tokita-san, thank you so much for joining me on this interview tonight. I'm so excited to be talking with you.
本日お話しいただきありがとうございます。今日はとても楽しみにしております。よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。
Alright, yeah, I'm looking forward to it too.
Excellent. And so the listeners, you will also hear another voice in this interview, not just mine and Tokita-san. You will hear my interpreter's voice, Samuel. Samuel and I have worked together for a couple years now, right, Samuel?
Yes.
Yeah, going back to that one exploratory meeting with the Muv-Luv folks. And Samuel, he was also the translator on Midnight Saga. So Samuel, I am so grateful for your time tonight, and thank you so much for doing this.
Yep, my pleasure.
Excellent. So let's dive right into this. Tokita-san, when did you play your first tabletop role-playing game? And if you don't mind my asking, what was that game?
初めて TRPG をプレイしたのはいつ頃でしょうか。またそれは、何のゲームでしょうか。
はい、私が、初めて TRPG をプレイしたのは、今から42年前、大学生20歳の頃で、初めてやったのはダンジョンズ&ドラゴンズです。
So I first played a TRPG 42 years ago. I was 20 and in university, and the first game was Dungeons and Dragons.
What was it about that experience, or just D&D since that was your first, that resonated so strongly with you?
TRPG、ダンジョンズ&ドラゴンズの中で、すごい魅力的に感じた部分はどこでしょうか。
すみません。最初のダンジョンズ&ドラゴンズの体験は、非常に、短くて、よくわからないものでした。とりあえず、ダンジョンマスターが作ったダンジョンに行ったんですが、2部屋目で天井が落ちて死にました。
なるほどですね。で、そこからちょっと先ほどいただいた内容で、そこから
はい。
ルーンクエスト、
はい。
の方がより響いたっていう形ですか？
そうですね。ルーンクエストの方が、当時の私の、気持ちにはぴったりきたと。はい。
わかりました。一旦それを伝えて、多分もう少しルーンクエストについて話すかと思います。
はい。
So his time with D&D was actually quite short, and he didn't get a very strong impression because he was running just an original dungeon that the dungeon master created, and his party actually wiped in the second room when the ceiling collapsed on them. So it was rather short-lived. He did, however, then transition into playing RuneQuest, which is the TRPG that had a more formative impact on his impression towards TRPGs.
That's a great story. What a wild first impression of a tabletop role playing game. It must have struck you though, because you came back to it. So did you know right away? And sorry, this wasn't on the question sheet, but it just dawned on me. Tokita-san, did you know right away that this was something that you were going to love, or did it take a couple play sessions for you to realize that?
いや、面白い話ですね。もうすぐパーティーが絶滅したんですけど、TRPG、まあ、そのダンジョンズドラゴンズをプレイして、なんていうか TRPG がすぐ、これ好きだなと感じたのか、まあ、もうちょっと時間がかかって、なんか他のゲームをプレイしてから、やっぱりこれ面白いなと思ったのかな。
僕自身はその前に、ソロアドベンチャーの、バーバリアンプリンスというゲームを遊んでいて、そういう形のキャラクターを作って遊ぶ冒険ものっていうのにはすごく興味を持っていて、D&D もそういう意味では期待していたんですが、ちゃんとプレイできるところまでいかなかったので、よくわからなかったと。ただまあ、そういったストーリー、キャラクターを作って遊ぶロールプレイング的な要素にはずっと興味を持っていて、半年ぐらい経ってから、別の人に、ルーンクエストを教えてもらって、そこですごく魅力に感じたという感
あり
じです。
がとうございます。So, before playing D&D, he had actually played a solo, I guess, tabletop experience called Barbarian Prince. So from the get-go, sort of before his first like tabletop session, he had known that he liked character creation and questing with an original character. He had high hopes for D&D, but you know how it is if you just don't have the right group or the right GM at the time, it just didn't click with him. It wasn't the best experience. But he had already had a love for role playing games. And so, about 6 months after his Dungeons and Dragons debacle, I suppose we could say, a different person introduced him to RuneQuest. And as he sort of alluded to earlier, that was really the game that got him started.
Okay, yeah, a debacle definitely sounds like the right word to describe that experience. So it sounds like RuneQuest really played a key factor in your love for this medium, Tokita-san. Can you share what inspired you, though, to make that transition from player to designer?
まあ、やはりそのダンジョンズドラゴンズではなく、そのルーンクエストに出会ってから、本当にその TRPG が、なんていうか、好きになったかと思いますが、プレイヤーからやはりクリエイターになりたいと思ったきっかけは、何でしょうか？
はい。もともと、私自身が SF をたくさん読んでいて、こういったものに近いものは何かクリエーションをしたいとは思っていました。で、ルーンクエストに出会って、出会ってと言いますか、SF のコンベンションで、友人がやはりルーンクエストを始めたので、そのマスターをやってくれると。で、まあ、多分シナリオ的にはアップルレーンの冒頭で、キャラを作って、バブーンのスリングによって、まあ、割と早めに死んじゃうんですが、システムが非常に、美しかったというか、ので、僕自身はルールブックを持っていなかったんですが、どうしても遊びたいというので、その友人は遠方に住んでいたので、僕は記憶に、沿って、ルーンクエストっぽいゲームシステムを再現し、大学の仲間と2年ほどキャンペーンをやって、まあ、そうするとオリジナルワールドとか作るわけですよね。 シナリオもオリジナルで作るし、モンスターもオリジナルで作るしっていうので、そこで、デザイナーっぽいことをやり始めてしまい、そこが楽しかったというのが、出発点かなと思います。
なるほどです。
は
Um,
い。
So he was a big fan of science fiction, from even before all of this started. And so he's always had a desire to sort of have a game experience similar to that. And that sort of ties in with his first Dungeons and Dragons experience, where he kind of wanted to bring in some sci fi elements. Um, his sort of meeting with RuneQuest happened at a science fiction convention where a friend of his ran a session as a GM. It sounds like that session was also rather short-lived, but what he came away with is that the system was very beautifully done. He didn't own a rule book, and the friend who introduced it actually lived quite a ways away. But even so, he wanted to play more of this game. So what he did is he used his memory of that play session and sort of created his own homebrew version that he then used for a 2-year campaign using all original monsters and the scenarios that he ran with his college friends. So his encounter with RuneQuest and then his desire to continue playing that game even without the resources to do so led him to sort of do designer-ish things quite early on in his tabletop gaming experience.
That's a fantastic story of getting into the medium as a designer just by homebrewing something from memory. That's really fantastic. It's funny how many designers have such unique stories that explain how they got into the medium. Speaking of the medium, the tabletop RPGs are such there's such a unique form of storytelling. Tokita-san, what was it about this medium that captivated you more than, say, other forms of creative expression, like writing novels or designing video games, for instance? You could have gone in any direction, and you went the direction of TTRPGs. Why?
他のエンターテインメントと違って、TRPG は他人と共にストーリーを紡ぐもので、なんかこう、いろんな小説だったり、ビデオゲームだったり、いろんなこう、遊び方、なんかものを作る形はいろいろあるんですけど、やはり TRPG を作りたいと思ったのはなぜでしょうか？
私にとっての TRPG の魅力っていうのは、僕自身がゲームマスターをして、プレイヤーとの間で物語が出てくる、生まれてくるのを、見るのが好きだという部分があります。基本的に僕は TRPG はゲームマスターしかやらない人で、ゲームマスターとして、世界を提供する、あるいは皆さんに、冒険の舞台を提供するっていうのが、僕にとっての魅力です。小説とかも書かないわけじゃないんですが、そこはなんかお仕事になるほどはうまくないですね。というのは、試しはしてますというところです。はい。
Um, So he loves being a game master and creating a story through that collaborative storytelling that TRPGs allow. Um, he generally is always GMing rather than playing, as one of the adventurers. So his experience is very tied to, uh, depicting the world for the players to enjoy, providing a setting and a story. Um, you mentioned novels, and it's not that he doesn't write his own novels, but he's not necessarily a professional level writer. He feels much more confident and pleased with his work when creating TRPG systems.
And when you were first kind of getting into designing your own systems, were there any particular designers, authors, creators, whatever word you want to use there, that shaped your approach to how you designed games?
自分のオリジナルゲームを作り始めた頃、自分のこう作り方と、そのゲームクリエーションに対しての考え方に強く影響したゲームデザイナーとかいましたか？
ゲームの作り方 という意味では、僕はかなり変な作り方をしているので、あれですが、一応、プロになり始めた頃に、やっぱり大きな影響を受けたゲームとして、シャドーランがありまして、シャドーランを作ったファサのチーム、および例えばそこで大活躍しているトム・ダウドという人には、尊敬の念を抱いています。
He believes himself to kind of have gotten into this and creates games in an unusual way, sort of different from many other creators. So he's not sure if he's the regular thing that you'd expect. But when he was just starting out as a game creator, Shadowrun was a game that was very influential on him. So he sort of looked to the FASA Games design team and particularly Tom Dowd as sort of his role models uh, when he was just getting his feet wet as a game creator.
Well, Tokita-san, you're a man after my own heart. Shadowrun, I consider to be, my game that I play. I got into the medium through D&D, just like you, but found my love of it with Shadowrun. So I love that we share that connective tissue there with Shadowrun. How did your early experiences, be it as a player or more likely, based on what you've said so far, as a GM, inform your approach to creating games?
まずブラッドリーさんも似たように、そのダンジョンドラゴンズの体験あったんですけど、実はシャドーランはすごく今でもやっていて、なんか TRPG の中でそれが一番好きな作品であると、なんていうか、時田さんの答えを聞いてちょっと嬉しかったですと。
はい。
で、プレイヤーとしての経験、本当はその GM、ゲームマスター、ほとんどやってるっていう話なんですけど、どのようにゲームのデザインの考え方を、そのゲームマスターとしての経験は、どのようにそのデザインへの考え方を影響したんですか？
一つは、ゲームマスターの時に、ある意味、シナリオでプレイヤーを驚かせると言いますか、プレイヤーの、感情を刺激するっていうのを、が、あの、モチベーションとかゲームの、盛り上げに役に立つので、そこを、注意し、えーあくまでも、プレイヤーキャラクター、プレイヤーとのゲームマスターのやりとりで話が進むように、考えています。
When you're a GM, your goal is to sort of surprise players to make them excited and elicit emotions via the story you're telling. And so he always wants to be, as a creator, conscious of that, conscious of the way that the story you're telling and the systems involved make players feel, and also how it facilitates the interaction between GM and players in order to create that story.
Yeah, it goes back to that shared storytelling. It sounds like it really resonates with him, and I feel like you can see that a lot in Tokita's designs.
Mhm.
Tokita-san, did you? I'm thinking about Shin Megami now. Did you always envision yourself working on role playing games that tie into large or well known IPs like Shin Megami?
そのデザイナーになった頃、もう本当に最初
はい。
から新女神転生のような、有名なタイトル、他の IP に関わる作品を作りたいと思ったんですか？
私自身は、基本的にはオリジナル思考です。自分の、やってきたゲームを形にしたいとか、ある意味テーマ性を優先して、ゲームデザインをするというのが多いのですが、そういう意味では、新女神転生と出会ったのは、あくまでも偶然で、雑誌での RPG の新製品レビューを担当していたので、そこでの提案が制作者に伝わって、このシリーズに関わることになりました。
So he actually is more interested in, or he originally is more interested in creating his own original TRPGs. He thinks it's very important to him to focus on a thematic experience that draws on his own sort of gameplay experiences, his own preferences. Working on SMT was more of a happy coincidence. That came about because he was originally working as a TRPG reviewer for a popular game magazine here, and he made a few remarks about the original SMT TRPG system that got back to the creators, and that sort of led to him being brought on for the game.
Oh, what an incredible happy accident! I wish I would imagine a lot of people wish they had that kind of happy accident in their life. That's fantastic. I'm going to ask more questions about what it was like to make that jump into working on SMT here in just a bit. But thinking about Tokita-san, how you like creating worlds, and you didn't always envision working on IP based games, but creating your own worlds. Looking back on your career, is there a specific game or project that you feel was a defining moment for you as a designer? And how did that project shape your work thereafter moving forward?
あのその、女神転生の TRPG の、すごいなんていうか、偶然だったけど、本当に、嬉しい偶然であって、多分、もう少しその話は聞きたいと思うんですけど、ちょっと後半になるかなと思って。で、次の質問としては、今までのキャリアを振り返ってみれば、ゲームデザイナーとして自分の腕を代表する、なんか思い出のプロジェクトや作品とかありますか？
はい。もともと私が、大学時代からやっていた作品のワールドを使って作った、ダークファンタジーものの RPG で、深淵という作品があります。一応第2版まで出て、現在第3版を作ってるところなんですけども、非常に、今でいうナラティブな RPG で、ストーリーテリングを重視し、あるいは、それこそ、ファンタジー小説やファンタジー映画のような、キャラクターの設定の深みとか、運命の、絡まりとかを再現するように作ったゲームです。一応こちらの方が私の代表作と言うべきところだと思います。
ありがとうございます。
え
あ、すいません。
はい。
あ、大丈夫ですか？
これ、他にもたくさん作ってるんで、一個一個説明すると無限に続きます。
わかりました。やは
はい。
り多分自分のゲームが全部子供のように可愛いと思うかと思うんで
はい。
すけど、やはりこれが一番なんか、自分の代
そうですね。
表としてはこれだ。わかりまし
はい。
た。Um, So, Bradley, I actually went ahead and split this question into two. I'm going to ask him about how creating that game uh, influenced his career in just a second. But first, I wanted to let him sort of talk about his defining project because I think he has some very strong feelings about that, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Um, the first game that came to mind when you asked what is a sort of career defining project was creating this game called Shingen, which means abyss. It is an original dark fantasy TRPG that he made based on the setting that he had created for his original RuneQuest experience in university. So his university setting and sort of dabbling with being a creator, then went on to influence this game that he considers to be his opus. Shien has a second edition out in Japan, and he's currently working on the third edition now. It's a very highly narrative, storytelling focused game. that he sort of created to replicate the level of depth that you get with like fantasy novels and fantasy films. He did at the very end want to remark that, of course, he's worked on many other games and he treasures them all. But if he just had to select one, it would be Shinen.
And I actually can picture Shien's cover art. So exciting to hear that a third edition is being worked on.
I'm going to go ahead and ask him the second part of that question now. ちょっとそこからの続きなんですけど、支援を作った経験、またはもう他のゲームを作った経験なんですけど、やはりその自分にとしてその大きな思い出のプロジェクトをできてから、それからの仕事とキャリアにどんな影響があったんですか？
僕自身は最初は、本当に雑誌のライターでした。雑誌に記事を書いている方が多かった。で、新縁が出て、それと並行して、アメリカの同人 RPG である It Came from the Late 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 Show という作品を日本に翻訳するプロジェクトに参加しまして、私の当時持っていた会社で出版しました。僕個人としてはその他に、電気物のタイトルというか、超古代文明の遺産を集める、ブルーローズという、アクション RPG、アクションものの TRPG を作りまして、これの時に、ある意味超古代史を、全部やり直しまして、その結果、なんかいろいろなものを、知識を広げることができたので、その後の、私の仕事に大きな影響が出たかなと思います。ある意味作品を一個作れたことで、デザイナーとして、認知されることができたということかと思います。はい。
ありがとうございます。So he started off before he was creating his own games as a writer for different game magazines. He was doing reviews and other articles, and then he released Shinen. And then around the same time, and I might ask him a little bit more about this, but it sounds like he was also doing some translation work. So Shinen came out, and at around the same time, he translated this indie TRPG from America based on it came from the Late Late Show TRPG, um, and he published it through his own company at the time. And it sounds like that also allowed him to release some other original like action TRPGs. So by creating one game, it seems that was what allowed him to put himself on the map as a game designer and create other opportunities going forward.
It's an interesting career arc. It's just funny how these things, Tokita-san, how they just sometimes fall into place and we don't even mean them to.
なんかこう自分が意図したなんていうかキャリアパスっていうかこの道ではなく、もう本当にゲームを出して、翻訳の仕事もされたかと思うんですけど、なんかこう機会があったから次の機会が得られたみたいな、なんていうかその偶然みたいなあのことかと思うんですけど、本当にその幸せなことが多かったんですね。
はい。私は幸運だったと思うのは、多分日本だと僕の、仕事のメインのものが、アメリカのトレーディングカードゲームであるマジック・ザ・ギャザリングが日本に上陸したときに、その翻訳チームを率いた形になっていて、2000年ぐらいまでは紹介記事をたくさん書いていたというのもあります。ここで 実は最初に言った深淵っていうのは、ダイスの他にカードを使うゲームで、91枚の、運命カード、ディスティニーデックというべきものを使うんですが、その前、それはマジックの翻訳をする前からやっていたことなんですが、よくそういうふうに見られることもあります。はい。
So it sounds like one of the major things he was working on um, in his career was translating Magic the Gathering into Japanese, which sort of provided him other career opportunities. He also wrote, it sounds like, introductory articles, sort of articles talking about Magic and helping to introduce it to the Japanese audience until around 2000. Um, he mentioned that his game Shin also has a deck of 91 Destiny cards that he worked on prior to Magic. So it sounds like he also does have a lot of experience with sort of card based games, not just dice based games.
Which makes a lot of sense. Tokita-san, we were discussing a project, I guess about a month ago, and you had proposed some tarot cards as a part of the gameplay loop. And now I have a better context for why cards would be integrated into some of your works, because you have a history there translating Magic the Gathering. This is not on my question sheet, but Tokita-san, have you done translations for Shadowrun into Japanese?
なんかすごいなるほど、なんか以前そのゲームプロジェクトの話し合いでそのタロットをなんか入れる話があったようなんですけど、やはりマジックの翻訳に関わったから、そのシステムにカード入れることは、さすがになんていうか納得する話なんです。で、ちょっと質問リストには入ってなかったんですけど、時田さんは、シャドーランの日本語版の翻訳に関わったんですよね。
はい。ここすると補足説明が必要なんですが、まずシャドーラン日本では、2版と4版と5版、あと 20th アニバーサリーが、翻訳されています。で、2版の翻訳者は別の方で、これは富士見書房といって角川の一部から出ました。で、21世紀になってから、別の出版社の方が4版を翻訳するというなった時に、そこから、だから4版以降は私が翻訳を担当しています。
なるほど。
はい。
So a little background to answer your question. So in Japan, Shadowrun 2E, 4E, 5E, and the 20th anniversary edition have been released. 2E was handled by someone else. It was originally published by sort of a child company of Kadokawa. But after entering the 21st century, a different publisher took on the fourth edition, and that's when Tokita-san was brought in, and he's been working on the game since.
Okay, yes. I thought I thought that was the case, but I've never had a chance to ask you, Tokita-san, what your work, the extent of it was on Shadowrun. So, okay, great. So we've talked about a lot of different types of tabletop role-playing games thus far. Shin Megami, D&D, RuneQuest, Shadowrun, of course, Xian. The role-playing game community has a unique culture and history in Japan compared to other parts of the world. How would you describe the TRPG scene when you first started, and then how has it evolved over the years?
今までいくつかのTRPG タイトルがちょっと話に出たかと思うんですけど、日本において TRPG 文化と歴史は海外とのなんか異なる部分があるかと思います。時田さんが初めてプレイした頃と、TRPG はどのように思われたとか遊ばれたのかと、あとそれからはどのような変化を見てきたのでしょうか。
はい。日本の、 におけるTRPG の、入り方というのでは、一つは、シミュレーションゲーム、からの流れで、シミュレーションゲームを販売していた会社が、その次の、ものとして、TRPG の初期のものを販売した。では、ルーンクエストとか、っていうのは、ホビージャパンさんという会社が、当時は、翻訳して出していました。で、その他に、SF ファンの中から、TRPG を紹介するというのがありまして、現在、日本の TRPG 業界というか、ボードゲーム、アナログゲーム業界を牽引する、安田仁さんという方がいらっしゃいまして、この方はもともと SF の翻訳者で、その流れの中で、テーブルトーク RPG やボードゲームなどに注目されて、そちらを紹介するお仕事から、現在はそういったボードゲーム、RPG、マーダーミステリーなどを、あるいはゲームブックなどを、翻訳したり、制作したりして出される会社を、経営されております。はい。で、僕が始めた頃は、そういう意味ではシミュレーションゲームの延長線だったんですが、僕がデビューする、1987年の少し前ぐらいからゲームブック、ファイティングファンタジーですね。ブームが日本で起こりまして、これと並行して、D&D のプレイを紹介する雑誌記事が載りました。これが大人気になりまして、これをベースにして、制作された小説が、ロードスト戦記、レコード・オブ・ザ・ロードス・ウォーですね。で、これが大人気になってアニメになり、日本ではテーブルと、小説サイドから、小説サイトから TRPG へ向かう流れが、だいたい1980年代の後半、終わりぐらいから広がり、この時にそのプレイした説明の記事の形態っていうのが、お芝居の脚本みたいな形で、書かれていたのですが、これがリプレイノベルという形で普及し、1990年代から2005、6、10年ぐらいまでは、これが、非常に、TRPG への、エントリーの役目を果たしました。で、その後、21世紀、0年代の終わり、2010年前後ですね、少し前ぐらいから、動画で、TRPG を紹介するという、文化が広がりまして、これで、中核を担ったのが、コール・オブ・クトゥルー。日本では、今、角川さんの方から、クトゥルフ神話 TRPG という名前で出ております。こちらの方は、私はちょっと、サポートチームではないので、細かいことは言えませんが、一応、そちらの方のシステムで、もう一冊本を書かせていただいてます。はい。ちょっと長くなってすみません。こんな感じで。
ありがとうございます。So TRPGs began establishing a foothold here in Japan in sort of two different ways, sort of via strategy games, more of the board game side, and through science fiction and other and fantasy novels. Um, so he personally learned about TRPGs through the latter, as he sort of alluded to before with his science fiction background. He wanted to say that Yasuda Hitoshi, who is a science fiction translator, played a big role in introducing TRPGs and board games and he currently works at a company that publishes TRPGs, murder mysteries, and other tabletop games here in Japan these days. At first, so around when he made, before he made his debut, the strategy game, board game side was more dominant. But around 1987, when he debuted, there kind of came a shift where fantasy novels based on gameplay experiences started sort of representing the medium. These are called replays, and sort of as a translator's note, they're kind of like actual plays. They are not fantasy novels that are adapted from session transcripts and then published. The most popular of these is The Record of Lotus War, as Tokita-san mentioned. And with some of these, they've become so popular that they've even gotten manga and anime adaptations. So these novel replays sort of sparked the next big wave of interest in TRPGs, and this continued until about 10 years ago, and served as the primary sort of entry gate for players into the TRPG medium. The next shift came around 2010. Sort of online videos and live streams, having people show themselves playing or having graphics with their voices behind them for their games, sort of replaced replays as the primary point of entry for TRPGs. And from this came the overwhelming popularity of Call of Cthulhu here in Japan. He doesn't know too much about this series since he hasn't worked on it as sort of like a primary creative, but it does sound like he has had some professional contact with. Pardon? Oh, no worries. It does sound like he has had some professional contact with Call of Cthulhu as well.
So yeah, it's interesting. Replays, Tokita-san, are very rare in the West, to the point that when LionWing published our first Japanese TRPG, which was Picaresque Roman, I remember having a conversation with the team internally about, do we include this replay or not? Do people want this? Will they want it? Will they find value in it? And we got such great feedback on the replay in that book. So I think there's great power in the replay, but it makes sense how the more traditional replay kind of gave way to the actual play era around 2010, as you said. And so it's fascinating to hear how the scene has evolved in Japan, because I think the scene in the West has evolved a little bit differently, which you would expect to some degree, but it's always fascinating to me just to see how the same medium can be experienced and grow in two different ways depending on where it's at in the world. So it's just fascinating to see that.
やはりアメリカとかその海外にはそのリプレイというものが割となんていうか少ない、あんまり知られていなくて、ライオンウィング社の初日本 TRPG を海外に出した時もリプレイ、そのあったリプレイを本に入れるかどうかちょっと悩んでたらしくて、で、実際に入れたところではプレイヤーからすごい良い反応があったので、やはりリプレイは海外でもその可能性があるなって感じました。だからやはりその今の時代になってその配信だったり、ニコ動のビデオだったり、その動画の方がなんていうか最近人気になったのは、やはりなんていうかその時代の変わりをちょっと感じますね。で、日本とアメリカのその TRPG はなんていうか同じ TRPG なんだけど、やはりその違う遊び、楽しめ方とか、違うなんていうかその成長の仕方を見て、やはり面白いですね。
はい。その辺は、やはり、日本の場合、リプレイ文化もありますが、実際リプレイ文化の時には、やっぱりライトノベルズ、若者向けの、読み物の形として、流行した部分があり、TRPG 自体はその頃は割と、マニアックな趣味だったんですが、それによって一段階、広がった部分があります。今回出していただく新女神転生3、の TRPG に関しても、うちの開発スタッフのある西上正樹君が一冊リプレイを書かせていただいてます。その後、続編的なメガテンの TRPG を作るんですが、そちらでは、僕が10冊ぐらいそういうの書いて、はい。
So in Japan, the replay culture and having that sort of be adapted into light novels for sort of younger, not younger, but sort of a lighter and younger audiences um, is sort of a part of the culture here, and is really where the replays took off. Where initially TRPGs were kind of a niche hobby. The popularity of these replays are really what helped the hobby sort of broaden and open up to a wider audience. He also wanted to mention that Masaki Nishigami, one of the members on the SMT3 TRPG, also wrote a replay for this game, and he himself has also written quite a number of replays.
I do not own the SMT Nocturne replay. It's the one of the only SMT RPG books that I don't own, and it slays me knowing that I do not own that replay book. I desperately want it. Tokita-san, you've had an amazingly enduring, prolific career in the TTRPG space. What's the secret to longevity in an industry that often feels like it's not at all geared towards such longevity?
時田さんは何十年も TRPG デザイナーとして活躍してきました。TRPG は長く活躍するのが難しい業界かと思うんですけど、その継続するためには何が必要かと思いますか？
私は多分かなり幸運だったと思います。雑誌記事などをやってる関係上、その都度最初にオリジナル作品を出せた。ちょうど日本がある意味、元気だった時になんとか出せて、それから、なんていうか、幸運な出会いがあり、メガテンの TRPG に、関わらせてもらったり、マジック・ザ・ギャザリングの翻訳から、最終的に TRPG その他の翻訳になったり、実はずっと同じゲームをサポートしてるというわけではなくて、その都度その都度、10年単位で、結構違う仕事をしている瞬間があります。だから、最近ですと、えっと、日本でコロナの5、6年前からマーダーミステリーというゲームが流行っていて、そちらの方を作らせてもらったこともありますし、えーあるいは今は、例えば、Tales from the Loop のような、ナラティブなゲームの翻訳などをさせてもらったりする。こちらの方も非常に、えっと、良い出会いがありましたし、一昨年出した、信長の黒い城という作品は、スウェーデンのフリーリーグ社の、モルグボルグ、あるいはサイボルグとの、出会いが、刺激になって作った作品だったりします。だからそういう意味では、良い出会いをし続けたことが、結果として長い間、 ゲームデザイナーとして、業界に関わらせていただいた、理由になるかと思います。はい。
So initially, he said he feels that it was mostly due to luck that he's been able to continue so long. But to sort of supplement with an additional thing that he mentioned at the end, it also sounds like the connections that he's made throughout his career have also sort of been one of the reasons that he's continued to be able to create so much. Um, he, as he said earlier, he started off with magazines and then went on to publish his own TRPGs. Uh, and he says that part of it is because Japan had a bit of a stronger economy back in, 3 decades ago. Um, and that was sort of when he was able to publish his own games, and through that he had the opportunity to work on the SMT TRPG. Because of his work translating Magic, he was able to translate other TRPGs into Japanese. One thing that he does want to mention is that he doesn't necessarily work on the same project all the time for all of these decades. It sounds like about every 10 years his work focus shifts to something slightly different. As an example, about 5 or 6 years ago, right around the pandemic, um, murder mysteries got very popular here in Japan, and so he's had a chance to work on some of those. Going back to his translation experience, he's worked on the Tale from the Loop TRPG translation, and also has translated a number of other TRPGs and narrative games into Japanese. And then another recent game he created uh, actually came about through meeting with a Swedish publisher. So to sort of go back to the beginning, part of it was luck, but part of it is also through the various connections he's made through other people throughout his career.
Well, and it sounds like with that luck, maybe that luck wouldn't have happened without the passion. So Tokita-san, what I heard in there is, yeah, there's some luck involved, but also some of the key ingredients to your longevity is passion, connections, and then also evolution. Kind of staying with trends. You talked about murder mysteries growing during that pandemic era, and being willing and able to pivot as a designer to meet that emerging need. Sounds like all of that together has allowed you to have this decades spanning career.
So Tokita-san just wanted me to mention that the Swedish publication that he mentioned as being an influence is called Morkborg.
Yes.
Excellent. で、やはりその運の部分もあったかと思うんですけど、その人とのその、絆っていうのかな、そのいろんな出会いがあって、その出会いがあったから、その、新しい可能性が広げたのと、やはりその時代とともにその臨機応変に、時に、翻訳とかボードゲーム、時にTRPG、時にマーダーミステリーとか、なんかこう一つのことに逆にそのこだわらずにいろんなことができるようになるっていうところが、やはりその長く活躍できるような、なんかためになったのかな。
はい。もう、とりあえずクリエイターとして、もう、年齢を重ねて経験を加えるのも重要なんですが、若い人と付き合って、今のユーザーに向けて刺激的なものを、提供できるっていうのは大きいことだと思います。というふうにかっこつけますが、単純に、いろんなゲームを見て、面白そうだと思ったことを単に追いかけているというのが、結果につながったのかなと思います。多分マジックの時もそうだったし、今回のモルクボルグに関しても、かっこいいゲームが来たよっていうのが、自分のクリエーションへの刺激になったと思います。はい。
So as a creator, obviously, with age comes experience. but he feels that it's very important to, have, colleagues of all ages, and also to have a good understanding of what appeals to the younger demographic in the hobby. Um, he personally, even though it's a bit of a broad statement, it's important to look at a lot of games and really find what makes them interesting, and then take inspiration from those parts that appeal to you. So, for one example, Morkborg he found was a very cool game, and it went on to inspire some of his own creations.
Yeah, it's I can imagine it can be hard to have this prolific career. You've done lots of different works, Tokita-san, but then also still trying to keep your finger on the pulse of what's new and being able to adapt and modify, how you've conceptualized TTRPG design over decades to be able to meet that new trend, to be able to connect with that younger audience. That has to be a challenging, pretty challenging feat.
やはり何年にかけてなんていうか変動していく、トレンドだったり今若者が楽しめるゲームをなんか作り出すのにやはり決して簡単ではないかと思うんですけど、時田さんは続いてそれができてるなってすごく感じました。
ありがとうございます。
Thank
日
you very
本
much.
のクリエイターだとこういうのを、かっこよく言えば若い気持ちを持つっていうんですが、単純に、日本ではよくこういう言葉を、中二病という言葉がありまして、中学生っぽいガキっぽい言葉を精神しか持ってないっていう、ちょっと自重的ではありますが、なので相変わらず、少年のままなんですねぐらいのところで受け取ってもらえば、そうあろうとしているというのが、現状だと思います。はい。
To put it in kind of a cool sounding way, he wants to hold on to that the feelings of youth and sort of feeling like inside he's still young and still has it, but he fears that what it is chunibyo, which is a very popular term that the listeners might have heard from anime and other sources, but that sort of mentality being stuck in sort of middle school, kind of just remaining the kid he always was instead of growing into an adult. Um, I think, just as an aside, I think the conception of that is very different in Japan and the West, where in the West we very much accept, holding on to that youthful passion. There's nothing wrong with people liking games all the way through their, later ages. But in Japan, there definitely is still that concept of, games are for kids, although that is changing quite a lot.
Yeah, I do think games are wonderful for so many reasons, Tokita-san. But one of the reasons why they're so great is they do keep us young in spirit, young at heart. And speaking of your career and how it's gone through multiple iterations, and you have so many books under your belt. Thinking about Shin Megami Tensei specifically now, and pivoting to that a little bit for this part of the conversation. I remember you in the beginning part of our talk today, you mentioned that you were writing for a magazine, and you were contacted as a result of some writing that you were doing about the first edition of the book. So you came in with Shin Megami Tensei II, which would have been the second edition. I believe that was released in '95. It seems like after '95, you were the primary driving force behind that series, behind the TTRPG adaptation of Shin Megami Tensei. How did that happen? How did you get to become kind of the point person, the chosen one for that franchise?
ちょっとこれから新女神転生 TRPG についてちょっと話したいのですが、
うん。
さっきちょっと話があったかと思うんですけど、その雑誌のレビューとかを書いた頃に、初版の SMT-TRPG のちょっとフィードバックをちょっと変えて、そのコメントがゲームクリエイターに受けて、そこから確かにその2から、続編から関わり始めたかと思います。1995年ぐらいかな、その2が出た頃かな。で、そこからずっと時田さんが SMTTRPG に関わっているなんですけど、その最初に関わる機会はどのように得たかについてはちょっともっと聞きたいと思います。
はい。まず最初に、新女神転生の、テーブルトップ RPG の歴史の話をしますね。1993年に、もともと、原作と言うべく、アトラスの女神転生及び新女神転生を制作したスタッフである鈴木和成さんという方がいらっしゃいまして、この方が、テーブルトーク RPG 版を制作されました。これが、新女神転生基本システムという名前で出版されました。で、当時私はホビージャパンの RPG マガジンで製品レビューをやっておりまして、そのシステムがちょっと複雑すぎるという点を指摘しました。鈴木和成さんはコンピューターゲームのデザイナーだったので、コンピューターゲームの内部で行われているような、計算式とか、そういったものを割とそのままテーブルトーク RPG に、移植してしまった部分がありまして、ちょっと、ルールが複雑になってしまっていました。で、そこを指摘して、こういうふうにしたら、もうちょっと簡単になるし、プレイヤーも遊びやすいんじゃないんですかという提案をしたことで、実質的にディベロップという形で、参加し、鈴木さんが、コンピューターゲームが本職ですんで、実質的に私の方で、続編である誕生編、および覚醒編を制作するということになりました。この辺は専門分野の違いで、現在でも鈴木和成さんはコンピューターゲームのデザイナーとして活躍されています。で、そちらの、誕生編と覚醒編では、我々の方で制作し、鈴木和成さんに監修をいただくという形をとっています。で、その後、残念なんですが、ちょっと版権の関係で、この角川というかエンターブレインでのシリーズは、一度、途絶してしまいます。で、そこで、新しい、その後ですね、昔の知り合いの編集者が、ジャイブ社という会社の出版社の、編集部長になったんで、私が売り込みに行ったわけですね。こういうゲームが作れますよっていうので、サンプルを持って、行きましたところ、そこの社長の方が出てきて、実はうちアトラスと同じグループの会社なんだよって言って、サンプルで持っていったメガテンの TRPG を見て、これ作ればいいんじゃないっていう話になって、その後、今回翻訳していただいた、新女神転生3ノクターンの、東京自体という作品、およびその続編の、マト 2000X というのをジャイブで作ることができました。はい、ここまで。
はい。So first, a little bit of background on the TRPG. In 1993, the very first version of the game, the Shin Megami Tensei TRPG Basic System, was released. This game was designed by Kazuya Suzuki, who was one of the creators of the original Megami Tensei and Shin Megami Tensei games. Um, at the time, I was working as a reviewer for Hobby Japan's RPG magazine, And in my review, I commented that SMT's system was a little too complex and offered some ideas of how it could be simplified and made easier to play. Um, so one of the things that he felt is that Kazuya Suzuki was a video game creator, and in video games you can have a lot of complex calculations and functions going on because like the back end
そう
handles that.
そう
はい。
機械翻訳した関係で、ちょっと変な翻訳になっていて、鈴木和成さんという名前です。和也さんではな
失礼
くなってきまし
しました。カズナ
た。はい。
リさん。わか
はい。
りました。
で、
す
お
みません。
願いします。はい。いえいえ、ちょっと僕が機械翻訳で、ざっと訳してチェックし漏れていたんでごめんなさい。
いいえ、こちらこ
はい。
そごめんなさい。So just a quick fix. It was not so Suzuki san's name is Kazunari Suzuki. So apologies for that. So Kazunari Suzuki is a digital game creator, and although video games can handle complex calculations, that tends to be a little too complicated if implemented as is for the tabletop. So with his experience working on tabletop games, Tokita-san provided some suggestions. One thing kind of led to another, and he ended up being brought on for the next versions of the game, and ended up working on the SMT TRPG Tanjouhen and Kakuseihen. I guess that would be Birth Arc and Awakening Arc in English. Um, so to talk a little about the SMT 3 TRPG, so talking about Nocturne, it sounds like maybe there were talks about creating this back when Enterbrain was the publisher, but it sounds like at some point that ended up being canceled. So there was going to be no Nocturne TRPG. But uh, one of his old acquaintances, one of Tokita-san's old acquaintances, coincidentally got a position as the head editor at Jive, which is a company that was part of the same corporate group as Atlas. So Tokita-san went to this acquaintance of his and brought a sample of the Nocturne TRPG and pitched the idea to him. And because they were in the sort of same company group, talks kind of were able to proceed, and he ended up being able to develop Nocturne, and then the game after that, SMT TRPG Mato Tokyo 2000X.
Wow, you talk about luck. What a fortuitous turn of events there. With Jive,
ですね。
that is just that's wild. I didn't know that part of the story. Certainly, as we've worked on this book, I've gotten bits and pieces of what went into the development of the title, but I didn't know that piece. So that's very fascinating. So,
Go
because
ahead.
Tokita-san, because it seems like all the design and writing duties, and I know you've had writing and design partners, so I'm not meaning to diminish them, but it seems like the primary duties they fell to you, starting with Megami Tensei II, the second edition, and then certainly picking up with Nocturne. You were so intricately involved with the TRPG series. How much creative freedom were you given by Atlas when you were designing these books, especially Tokyo Conception, since it was based on Nocturne, which at the time was the most popular entry in the series?
その SMTTRPG2 から、時田さんが関わってくるという話でしたが、新女神転生 TRPG をデベロップしたとき、どれほど自由に開発できたのか、特にその当時シリーズ一番人気だった東京受体については、気になります。
あの、実は私はこの、ノクターンに関してというか、新女神転生シリーズ全体ですが、あくまでも新女神転生という、ビデオゲームのファンの方が楽しめるようにということを気にして、デザインしています。なので、自由度の問題に関しては、実は、それほど、なんかオリジナリティを出す ということは意識していません。最初の誕生編、覚醒編の時には、やはり監修者として鈴木和成さんという実際にオリジナルのビデオゲームを作った方が後ろにいますので、その方の、が、も満足させ、なおかつ読者にも、メガテンのワールドで遊びたい、こんなキャラで遊びたいよねというのを再現できるように、考えていました。ジャイブで、再スタートしたノクターンの場合には、そのあたりをさらに、えっ、と、注意し、実はアトラスからは、あまりラインが崩れなければそんなに細かいことは任せよっていう部分があるんですが、逆に、システムとして、元々のゲームの、の中で出てくる、悪魔とかいろいろなもののデータをできるだけそのまま、テーブルトーク RPG でも再現できるように、工夫しました。はい。
So, for both Nocturne in specific and the SMT TRPGs in general, he didn't actually feel. I mean, in terms of freedom, it doesn't sound like there were any really heavy restrictions, but he also didn't need to have, a whole lot of originality within the system because uh, he is a fan of the SMT games, and so. One of his primary goal when working on Tanjo Hen and Kakusei-hen and then continuing with Nocturne and later games, he wanted to satisfy the fans and their desire to play as certain characters from the game and be able to work with demons and other aspects of the game that they were familiar with. Um, of course, Suzuki-san, the creator of the Megami Tensei and SMT games, was one of the supervisors on the project. So, his goal was make sure that the game satisfies the original creators as well as the fans. And one thing that he was able to do with Nocturne when working with Jive, Atlas sort of worked with them to implement the data for demons and other characters from the game more or less as they were in the original game to provide a very authentic experience to the players.
Well, and I think that's what I love so much about Tokyo Conception is it so faithfully adapts the video game to the tabletop and without making compromises to the systems that make Megaten what Megaten is, while also making sure not to get bogged down in too many systems. And so it rides this beautiful line of being such a faithful adaptation, but still remembering that it's a tabletop RPG. And I think that you can only find that balance if you are an expert designer in your field. And Tokita-san certainly is. Thinking about that creative freedom and how you said you didn't really need any because there's already so much creativity built into the Megaten universe. I think about in the entertainment industry, fans love when side content, supplementary, media or stories expand kind of on that core story of the franchise that they love. Canon, right? That's the word that often gets thrown around. Canon in particular is such a major point of interest for fandoms. People just love knowing that what they're reading, aside from the main franchise entries, whatever that might be, a movie or a game, means something within that universe. It's worthwhile. So were there ever any discussions with Atlas Tokita-san about incorporating elements from Tokyo Conception, such as a campaign or an encounter in that campaign, into incorporating that into the official Megaten canon universe?
ブラドリーさんはそのノクターンの TRPG は本当にあの原作になんていうかそっくりというか 原作を守りつつ、なんかテーブルゲームとしては、なんていうか、この障害なく遊べるようなものになってるのが本当に素晴らしくて、やはり時田さんのようなすごい腕のあるデザイナーがいるからこそ、それが出来上がったかと思います。で、やはりその自由度とかの話はあったんですけど、メガテンは最初からその、なんていうか自由に自分のキャラとか、ああいうことがある程度あったから、そんなに多くは必要なかったっていう話だったんですけど、ちょっとその次の質問については、エンタメ業界においては、原作ものが原点設定をなんか組み込まれたものが、ファンに好まれている。例えばそのストーリーに熱心なファンについては、本編のストーリーとつながるものがすごく好きで、そういう作品が人気です。東京渋滞の内容を逆に新女神転生に、なんていうか、その逆輸入っていうか、その導入する話について、なんかアトラス社と相談あったりとかしましたか？
それについては実はありません。アトラス社としては、一応、版権を出して、やってますが、TRPG との、コラボレーションまではいきませんでした。残念ですが。で、私自身もそこは難しいところだなというところが、両方のビジネススケールが日本ではかなり違っていまして、テーブルトーク RPG の、製品の売り上げと、ビデオゲームの売り上げでは、桁が2つ以上違うお金の世界なんで、2つえっと、あくまでも、こちらは、あちらの IP をお借りして、テーブルトーク RPG 版を出させていただいていますが、こちらからのフィードバックが、向こうのストーリーを変革するというところまでは、私どもも期待はしてませんでした。そこに関しては、実はTRPG を許可していただいた段階で、ファンの皆さんが、ご自分で遊んでいただいて、広げていただければありがたいと思います。以上。
ありがとうございます。So the simple answer is a no. That sort of discussion didn't happen for this game. While we were able to, get the rights, the IP rights in order to create this, it wasn't, a full integrated collaboration. As you can imagine, the sort of business scale in terms of sales for TRPGs and video games are very different by a few digits. So being able to borrow the IP and create a TRPG version was great. But their feedback, the sort of creations they made for Tokyo Conception, were not then used to influence the story of the SMT series, and they didn't expect that to happen from the get go. They knew what they were getting into. Ultimately, their goal or his goal as the creator, and I'm sure the entire team, is that they wanted to allow fans to have fun delving deeper into this world that they love so much, and they didn't really have any expectations of influencing canon in that sort of way.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, just being able to play in that Megaton sandbox and tell your own stories, I think is just as exciting as having something written into the book that is, a part of the official Megaton timeline. So we're talking about Nocturne. Tokyo Conception obviously is based on Nocturne. Tokita-san, Nocturne, obviously a single player video game. How did you adapt the narrative and gameplay structure to suit a group of players in an RPG setting? That just seems like it would be such a challenging thing to do.
原作の「新女神転生3ノクターン」は一人用ゲームで、人数で遊ぶ TRPG にコンバートするため、どのようにストーリーやゲームプレイを調整しましたか？やはり難しいかなとは、なんていうか、思います。
はい。この件に関しては、一番最初の鈴木和成さんが作った、新女神転生 TRPG 基本システムの段階で、あの世界で冒険する現代電気アクションとして、ゲームスタイルを作っていただきました。あの世界にはこんなキャラクターがいて、こんな、役割分担があって、という、流れを読んで、なので、様々にキャラクタークラスがあって、それぞれが、出ていく。で、もともとの新女神転生でも、プレイヤーが操作する主人公の他に、光の側のヒーロー、闇の側のヒーローがいたように、あと、ヒロインも独特の立場を持っている。そして、仲間として使う悪魔に関しても個性があるので、これらをキャラクターとして独立させることで、TRPG 向けの、マルチプレイヤーキャラクター、マルチプレイヤーのゲームにすることができました。このあたりはもう鈴木勝成さんの段階で、ある程度作られていたもんで、私の場合は、誕生編の時にクラスシステムを整えて、覚醒編の時にそれを広げるという行動で、実現することができました。そういう意味ではすごく難しい仕事を僕がしたわけではありません。以上。
ありがとうございます。To sort of start with the end of that, it actually wasn't that complicated, but that's largely because the original SMT TRPG base system designed by Suzuki-san had already laid a lot of the groundwork. This is a little tricky to translate. I think the best way to explain it is it had established itself in the modern day supernatural action genre. That's sort of the branding for the original TRPG. Uh, it had already established characters and classes, and so this sort of system where there are heroes of light and heroes of dark, and heroines with sort of a unique role to play in the story, and having the demons become characters in the TRPG. Was only really building on a base that was established from the base system that Suzuki-san created. When Tokita-san created the Tanjo-hen, his contribution was really that of sort of balancing and adjusting, making tweaks to the characters, or sorry, the classes and systems, and expanding on what had already been established. And so, to sort of reiterate, it was less challenging than you might imagine, but that's because someone else had already laid the groundwork.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And you mentioned, we're talking about gameplay structures, and you mentioned demons in there. Tokita-san, in your answer, of course, it gets me thinking about some of the hallmark features of what makes a Mega 10 game a Mega 10 game. And of course, demon summoning and fusion immediately come to mind. And they play a big part in Tokyo Conception too. So were there any specific challenges in adapting those specific mechanics, because they're pretty complex, into the TRPG format? How did you go about doing that?
悪魔書簡といえば、時を自体を含め、その新女神転生シリーズには、代表的な、悪魔書簡と悪魔合体システムがあります。割と複雑なシステムかと思いますが、どのように TRPG 用にコンバートできましたか？
はい。悪魔召喚は非常に重要なファクターだったので、ここをきちんと、ゲームに取り込むために、原作の悪魔召喚および悪魔合体の部分を分析して、ルールに入れました。特に悪魔合体の部分は、今回今日は来れませんでしたけど、開発チームの西上正君が、原作を非常に細かく解析して、バランスをとって、くれました。基本的には、TRPG 版への、バランス取りの中では、主人公である悪魔召喚師が強くなりすぎないように、 多少の制限を加えたというのがあります。以上。
So demon summoning is of course a very key part of the game. So they took special care with that. And the way that they approached it was to carefully analyze how it worked in the base game or in the original game, in the video game. One of the other members of the team, Masaki Nishigami, in particular, worked on analyzing the fusion aspect of the source game to make sure that it was implemented in a balanced way in the TRPG. And sort of overall, the team really paid close attention to make sure that the protagonists, the player characters in the game, the demon summoners, wouldn't be overpowered because of these systems.
The amount of balancing that had to have gone in this game is just astounding to think about. There's so much data in this game, and there are so many mechanics that have been so faithfully recreated within its system that I Tokita-san, I don't envy you and your team of having to QA this book and to make sure that the balance was just right. That seems like a gargantuan task. So while we're on the topic of features for which Shin Megami is known, of course, it's known for its, let's say, moral ambiguity and philosophical depth. How did you ensure that these elements were preserved in the TRPG? Because they're a lot more abstract than numbers and something that's more concrete, like the demon summoning mechanic.
やはりこのゲームの、作った時もQA の時もやはりデータが多いしバランスとかはすごい大変だっただろうねとブラッドリーさんが言ってます。で新女神転生の、なんていうか代表する部分としては、他にはその哲学的な深さとか、さまざまなモーラルを取り入れてるところなんですけど、その部分もどのように TRPG に入れたのですか？やはりこういうものは、なんていうか、その悪魔召喚、そのデータとか数字より、なんていうか、具体的ではないものなので、多分、なんか、そういうところもちょっと気になります。
はい。実は新女神転生のシリーズの、世界観のベースとなる哲学に関しては、鈴木和成さんから実際の原作を作った時の考え方とかをお聞きできたのと、私自身もゲームをプレイして、ローとカオスの陣営に神々や悪魔を分けて、その闘争の中で、物語を作ることにより、そういった、独特の世界観というのを、表現する方法というのを学びました。我々がオリジナルでやるというよりは、そういった哲学、あるいは、ゲームの中に表された、神話的な事象や、思想っていうのを、ゲームでも、だから悪魔データとかシナリオとかに入れ、あるいはそれを陣営を表すポイントをつけるっていうことで、ゲームシステムに取り組みました。そういう意味では、オリジナルのシステムというよりは、原作をリスペクトしたものだと思っています。以上。
As you say, the SMT series deals with a lot of these morality questions and a lot of philosophy. One thing that benefited him a lot is that Suzuki-san, the creator of the original, shared a lot of the philosophies and a lot of the sort of inspirations that went into the original video game. And in addition, Tokita-san spent time playing the original games closely, which he learned a lot from. You know, the original games have, gods and demons splitting into forces of law and chaos, and characters have their own, ideologies and values that bring them into conflict. So when working on the TRPG, he worked to incorporate key elements that are tied into this. So, for example, making sure that the mythology is correctly included, making sure that alignment and tendency, race and species that define different demons are part of the system, as well as using points to track the what is it the which law or chaos to which side a given character belongs to.
Were there, so we've talked about demon summoning and fusion and making sure that the game still has that strong morality and philosophical side to it. Were there any parts of the original video game of Nocturne that just did not translate to the tabletop, that you had to omit or modify in some way so that it fit better within the confines of a tabletop role-playing game?
えっと、原作の、
うん。
いろんな部分を、取り入れて、かなりリスペクトしてるっていう話なんですが、
うん。
どうしてもこの TRPG になんかこううまく対応しない部分、なんかその削らないといけない部分とか、もしくはその、大きくちょっと調整したりとか、なんかアダプトする必要のあった部分があったりしましたか？
えっと、戦闘のイニシアチブ関係は多少いじりました。ある意味データの扱う量っていうのはやっぱりテーブルトーク RPG の方が少なめになるので、そこで、ルールを比較的簡単なものにする。ある意味パーセントシステムに落とし込むという作業は、しています。イニシアチブとか、あるいは幸運的なポイント、TRPG ならではのヒーロー効果のポイントなどについては、全体のストーリーを再現するために、あえて、システムにオリジナルで入れてあります。もともと、メガテンの、ゲームの中にも、運という、効果がありますが、その効果を TRPG 向けにモディファイして、運の良さとかを表現するように工夫しました。
それか、
以上。
ヒーローポイントシステムですか？
はい。そうです。
わかりました。
はい。
Um, so of course there are parts of the original game that needed to change in order to work on the tabletop. One aspect, for example, is that they adjusted how initiative works. In sort of a more broad answer, there just needed to be less data for the TRPG to make it manageable. We kind of touched on this earlier, but there's just a lot of calculations you can do on the back end on video games that you can't do for the tabletop. So things had to be simplified, and that's one of the reasons for using the percent system that sort of runs the game. The other thing he wanted to mention is that there's a hero point system that was sort of originally created to represent the luck aspect of the original game, sort of making that bringing that over to the tabletop through this original system.
Huh. It's interesting. Yeah. You figure when you're making these conversions, Tokita-san, things have to be they have to be scaled down, they have to be simplified, they have to be omitted entirely. Were there any systems, sorry, this isn't on my question list, but it got me thinking based on what you just mentioned, Tokita-san. Were there any mechanics that you had designed or redesigned or modified and you were excited about them, but in the end they just didn't make the cut and they were left out for whatever reason?
やはり、ちょっとリストに入ってなかった質問ですが、やはりその TRPG 化するときに、やっぱりスケールと、なんていうか複雑さをちょっと考えて、よりちょっと調整して、テーブルトップゲームとして簡単に遊べるように、ちょっといろいろ調整するかと思います。で、ちょっとそこで思いついたのは、例えば、 自分がオリジナルに作ったシステム、もしくは、調整したシステムの中で、なんかこれ入れたいなと思って途中まであったんですけど、最終的にはちょっとカットする必要あったものがあったりしました？
あの、割と、思いついたことは入れちゃうタイプのデザイナーなので、あまりカットしたことはないんですが、戦闘などで、もっと複雑な、えっと、複雑というか巨大な規模の戦闘を解決するための、影響システム、そうですね、えっと、なんて言ったらいいのかな、戦争ルールみたいなのは何度も考えますが、なかなかそれを入れられる、規模の、世界を扱う TRPG ってなかなか作れないですね。
なるほど。わかりま
はい。
した。So, as a designer, his personal design philosophy is to include basically as much as he can of the things he comes up with. So honestly, there weren't too many cuts, but there is something that he had wanted to do that just didn't prove feasible this time. For battles, he had wanted to include some rules for kind of large scale conflict, sort of war rules and sort of systems of influence. But just because it's a TRPG, it just wasn't feasible to create such large scale conflicts within the confines of the game.
I'm now just imagining a world where we get to play large scale wars in our Shin Megami Tensei tabletop role playing games. Um, that's fascinating. I was not expecting that answer. That's really great. You mentioned battles there, and of course, it got me thinking about Shin Megami is such a gameplay first franchise, and with being a gameplay first franchise comes the layering of mechanics, many of which we've talked about here. But also in there is the difficulty and the challenge that the series is known for. So it got me thinking, because another hallmark feature of Megami Tensei is the oppressive atmosphere, the difficulty. Tokita-san, how do you approach balancing challenge, or how did you approach balancing the challenge in this game to maintain the tension that everyone wants out of an SMT game without overwhelming the players that are at the table?
えっと、メガテンはやはりそのゲームプレイを重視するシリーズであって、で、よく知られている点のもう一つを挙げるとしたら、やっぱり暑苦しい雰囲気とゲームの難易度で、TRPG をデザインした時には、やはりゲームの難易度をうまくバランスして、なんか適切な緊張感を与えつつ、プレイヤーになんていうか、ストレスを与えずに、なんかどのようにバランスできましたか？
はい。僕自身はテーブルトーク RPG はエンターテインメントだと考えています。なので、ゲームの、世界観として重苦しい雰囲気があるということは、提示はするものの、それはこちらから提示するだけで良いと思っています。特に新女神転生は、現代電気アクションであって、クトゥルフのようなホラーではないので、絶望的な雰囲気だけしか与えないのではなくて、こういう世界観ですよ、この世界観がかっこいいですよねっていうのが重要だったりします。私が作ったダークファンタジーの深淵もダークファンタジーって言ってますが、プレイ中は割と、笑い声が絶えない、ものだったりします。新女神転生でも、ゲームのシナリオの一部とか、あるいは途中の会話、特に悪魔との交渉なんかは、コミカルになったものでも構わないと思います。実際ジャック・フロストとか、秘宝系の悪魔っていうのは、ある意味、楽しい会話をもたらしてくれます。 ゲームの難易度に関しては、一応ゲームマスター向けに、PC、最初の頃であれば PC のレベルプラス5、キャンペーンの後半になったらプラス10っていう目安を提示して、この範囲でやってもらえばバランス取れますよというふうに提示をしていますし、ある意味原作がありますので、原作でこの悪魔が出てくるのはあのぐらいだよねっていうのを考えてもらうと、それだけで実はバランスが取れるんで、やっぱり原作ありがたいですね。以上。
ありがとうございます。So his philosophy is that TRPGs are meant as entertainment. So while it's perfectly fine to have the sort of oppressive, dark atmosphere of SMT be part of the setting, that's important to the game, it doesn't have to dictate the way the game feels all the time. This isn't a horror game like Call of Cthulhu, and even then, horror games don't always have to be depressing. It's okay if some of the dialogue during the game, leans towards the more comical and lighthearted side. Um, the his original dark fantasy TRPG Shin is also it's dark fantasy, so you can expect it to be kind of heavy, but you know his sessions are often filled with laughter and people smiling and having fun. And even just looking at SMT, this original series, if you think of Jack Frost and the other like He-Ho demons, um, the game still has lighthearted and fun and comical elements built in within the overall sort of dark and heavy and you know uh, sort of oppressive atmosphere that you mentioned. Oh, sorry. And for difficulty on the more mechanical side, uh, the way that he balance difficulty within the mechanical encounters is that for the initial part of the campaign, he said to have encounter levels based on the player level +5, and then towards the end of the campaign, about player level +10 is a good guideline for GMs to create balanced encounters. One of the things that he thought was a great boon while creating this is being able to reference the original games allowed him to sort of see what monsters and what enemies come out at different levels and sort of using that as reference. All right, well, if you're at this level and you're fighting this monster, then this is probably the right level of difficulty for the TRPG as well.
Sure. You mentioned, campaigns and encounters there. They make up the lion's share of a lot of TRPGs, and certainly with Nocturne, it's a very battle heavy game. What kind of when you were Tokita-san, when you were designing the encounters or the campaign that's in the book, what kind of player experiences were you most focused on creating?
ノクターンは、やっぱりその戦闘がとても重視なTRPG であって、この本の中に入ってるそのエンカウンターとか、なんていうか、キャンペーン、シナリオ、を作った際に、どんなようなプレイ経験を、目指していたんですか？どんな経験をプレイヤーに与えたかったんですか？
まず、ルールブックに入っている、シナリオというのが、そのワールドに入って、イントロダクションとなって、ルールを覚え、おおよその感覚を得るためにあると思っています。なので、序盤で、メガテンっぽいワールドの表現できる事件を起こし、そこから、シナリオに入っていければいいなと思っています。このあたりでは、歴代のメガテン、のビデオゲームシリーズの導入を意識しました。以上。
So, talking about the scenarios that are in the rule book, he intends the original or the original scenario that he created to serve as an introduction to the game, to as a sort of a way to teach the players the rules and have them become more familiar with the setting and the world. And the way he did this is by paying very close attention to the way that the video games start their stories, what sort of incidents kick off the adventure, and then creating something that is very reminiscent of that as a way to start the campaign for the TRPG.
And I'd imagine, a lot of this, as is normally the case in RPGs, a lot of painting the picture and creating or recreating the vibe of Nocturne and just the general feel of like a Mega Tin universe rests on the GM's shoulders. It's not solely on them. RPGs are a collaborative encounter, but the GM plays such a huge part in that. I was thinking back to the question about the morality and philosophical questions that Mega Tin poses to its players. Since the GMs are kind of controlling and facilitating the flow of these sessions, these scenarios, encounters, campaigns, how do you envision game masters handling the philosophical dilemmas and moral choices that are so central to Shin Megami?
やはり TRPG なので、GM、そのゲームマスターが、この世界観をプレイヤーに伝えたりとか、ストーリーはもちろんプレイヤーと協力して作っていくものですが、最初のきっかけとか、雰囲気とか、なんていうか、設定をなんか本当に想像できるようなためのいろいろちょっと説明しちゃいけないのはやっぱり GM で、ノクターンに重要な哲学的なジレマとか、モラル判断とか、その GM はどんな風に扱うと想定してましたか？
実はそこに関しては、原作がある。で、原作の提示の流れというのがありまして、我々は、原作でもそうですが、ローサイドに行っても、カオスサイドに行っても、あるいは、中間の決断をしても、それはもうプレイヤーの選択であるという、意識は、ビデオゲームと一緒です。なので、最初の初期の頃のセッションで、それを無理して、重く取り込む必要はありません。キャンペーンを続けていき、原作にある陣営とか親族とか、そういったものを、順次登場させていけば、そこに対して、プレイヤーが感じてくれるものがあれば、それで構わないと思います。基本的にはこの作品は、原作のテーマを伝えます。でも、そこは実はプレイヤーさんやゲームマスターはそれをどう扱うかについては自由です。実際、歴代の、様々なプレイヤーから感想を聞きましたけれども、世界を救う決断などせず、作ったプレイヤーで地元の悪い悪魔を倒して、1年以上過ごした人たちもいれば、そもそも悪魔と戦わないという選択肢すら、選んだ人たちがいます。僕は、そういった人々も自分、の決断も、尊重していきたいと思ってます。なので、買ったからには、このゲームはゲームマスター、あなたのものだと思います。以上。
ありがとうございます。So, when tackling issues like this, he really looks to the original game for inspiration. And if you think about SMT, it's the player's choice whether they want to go law or chaos or play a neutral route. And he wanted to replicate that freedom of decision in the TRPG. When playing this game in the original session, if you're not a super experienced GM, if you don't have a strong philosophical background, that's fine. You don't have to, bring in tons of heavy philosophy. You can just continue the campaign, enjoy what you're playing, bring in elements of the original, like the different sides of the conflict, different, gods and demons that suit the story. And as long as that's allowing the players to experience the themes of the original game, that SMT that are such a core part of SMT's story, that's serving its purpose. It's up to the players. They have the freedom to decide how they want to make use of these dilemmas and the moral questions. Um, he went on to say that you don't even have to save the world if you don't want to. There are players out there who defeat the demons and save the world, but there are other players who choose to, find ways to live alongside the demons. He wants the players to really have the freedom to create the stories that they want to create. And in so doing, he designed this game to put the power in the hands of the GM and the players and sort of let them make of it what suits them best.
And I know we are coming up on our 2 hours here. Tokita-san, I've got maybe 2 more questions. Do you have time for 2 more questions, or do we need a hard out in the next 2 minutes?
すみません。ちょっと時間的にはもう2時間にちょっとなりそうなところなんですが、あと2質問ぐらいありまして、もう少し時間いただいても平気ですか？
はい。とりあえず15分ぐらいだったら OK です。
ありがとうございます。
はい。
He says another 15 minutes or so would be okay.
Okay, perfect. All right. So,
ありがとうございます。
yes, thank you so much, Tokita-san. I really appreciate it. I was not keeping time very well. What aspect of Tokyo Conception are you most proud of?
ノクターン TRPG の一番自信のある、誇りに思うところは何でしょうか？
これは誇りに聞こえないかもしれないんですが、できる限り原作に近いものを作れたということが、私にとっての誇りです。これは、原作が大好きだということもありますし、これを一緒に遊んでくれるユーザーへの、リスペクトであると思っています。はい。
So this
以上。
might not ありがとうございます。This might not sound like sort of something that he's proud of necessarily, but to him, he's very happy with how loyal this game is to the original. He loves the SMT series, and by being so loyal to it, it shows respect not only to the original games, but also to the fans who he's creating this game for.
Yeah, I've used this term a couple times, Tokita-san, just the vibe, the essence of Shin Megami is so expertly crafted and captured in how this game has been designed, how it's been laid out, the art that's been used, how the core concepts have been adapted to be able to fit into the framework of a TTRPG. It really is, such an accomplishment that players really get a chance to step into this universe, and how you've designed this game. It really allows them to live inside this universe in a way that they haven't before. When you're playing through, let's say, Nocturne, you're playing it through the body and the eyes of this character that exists, and they're a fairly blank slate, but still you are playing a character. In Tokyo Conception, though, you get to be the character. You are the person in the world. You are the person who's confronting these challenging situations, these moral ambiguities and philosophical ponderings in a way that you don't in the video game, just because there's this connective tissue that exists in a collaborative storytelling environment that we call TTRPGs that does not exist in just its digital counterpart. So I was glad to hear that you talked about that faithful adaptation being such a proud moment for you, because you really have nailed that aspect of this. For those new to Shin Megami, or tabletop RPGs. And I think we're going to have a lot of folks who are not new to Shin Megami, but are new to tabletop RPGs. And this might be their first tabletop RPG, and the only reason they're playing it is because it is a Shin Megami game. Tokita-san, what advice would you give to those GMs or those players who are diving into this game for the first time?
ブラドリーさんはまずその原作にとても近いその雰囲気をそのまま TRPG にできたというところはすごくブラドリーさんも感じ、なんかそれだからこそその世界に本当にこの TRPG を通して入って原作のゲームでちょっとできないこともなんかこの経験ができて、でそれからこそ本当に素晴らしい TRPG だと思いましたと。で、ちょっと次の質問としては、新女神転生をプレイしたことあるけど、TRPG 経験がない人はおそらくこの TRPG、やはりその原作のファンだから TRPG をちょっとやってみたいと思うプレイヤー、でも TRPG の経験がないから、これをプレイする際に何かアドバイスがあったりします？
はい。ある意味、こういった原作ゲームというのは、その原作の好きな方を、TRPG の世界にお招きする招待状だと思っています。なので、原作の、あのシーンをやりたいっていうところから始めていただいて、その元のゲームの思い出を、元に、このゲームで、遊んでもらえればありがたいです。例えば、ノクターンの冒頭のあたりの、東京を辞退してから変容した世界をさまよう。そこで、モンスターと戦って生き残る。そういう経験を最初は、シナリオとしてやれば、いいと思っています。はい。もう、やっぱり原作ものゲームなんで、原作の面白さの一つの可能性として、楽しんでもらえるのがありがたいです。そこで、メガテンで見出した物語を、TRPG で遊べるようにしたんで、一緒に遊びましょうという感じで、気楽に入っていただけるとありがたいです。
I really love the way
以上。
that he phrased this. Games like this that are based on an original game are sort of an invitation to the world of TRPGs. They're saying to players of video games, you love that game, here, enjoy more of it in this setting. And it allows them to take their desire to sort of re experience certain scenes or stories from video games and either completely replicate them on the tabletop or reapproach them from a different angle. But it allows them to bring their passion for the originals to the tabletop. So, for example, at the start of Tokyo Conception, when you're transported to this other world and you're surviving attacks from monsters and sort of wandering and trying to survive, that's a great way to start a scenario. Games like this that are based on original IP, or sorry, on other IP, are really great tools to not only enjoy games that you love, but also to bring new players into the TTRPG space.
Well, and you touched on something there that I think is so powerful about specifically IP-based tabletop role-playing games inviting in players who would have never checked out a tabletop RPG otherwise. And that is, yes, it gives players the chance to recreate something one for one that they've played in the digital counterpart, but it also gives them this one-of-a-kind opportunity to play out the what if factor. What if, instead of this happening in the game, what if this happened instead? How would the rest of the story fall as a result of that one thing being different? And that's not something you can ever get from a video game. It's telling its story, and it's got its story beats defined, and it's a 3-act structure, and it's going to drive you along this story. But that's not what tabletop RPGs are. And so being able to see things from a different perspective or to alter story events in a game, I think is very special and unique to this medium. So I love that you touched on a little bit of that there. Tokita-san, I have to know, are there other video game franchises that you'd love to adapt to the tabletop like you have with Shin Megami?
この SMT-TRPG と同じように、他にこう原作に基づいて TRPG を作りたい、IP だったりシリーズだったり、なんかそういうものがありますか？これ作ってみたいとか。
メガテンを作っていて、やはりアトラスさんの、ペルソナシリーズは、特に3、4が好きなので、このあたりの、を作りたいという話はよく出版社とするんですが、アトラスさんの方の許可が取れませんで、残念ながら実現しておりません。一応その他に、一応アトラスさんの方から許可を取って、東京モノハラ市という TRP、ビデオゲームの TRPG を作らせていただいたことがあります。このあたりはやってみたいなと思っています。が、ちょっと残念ながら、そちらの方も今、権利切れてしまって、ちょっと絶版になってしまっています。はい。その他、映画関係とかのゲームは作ってみたいんですが、今のところ、どれをという感じまでは言ってないですね。はい。こんな感じです。
はい。
以上。
So he's personally very interested in creating a TRPG adaptation for the Persona games, especially 3 and 4, which he's particularly a fan of. But although he's sort of spoken about it and pitched it to publishers, they haven't been able to get the green light from Atlas just yet. So nothing there yet. On a related note, they did at one point get the ability to create a TRPG based on an Atlas game that hasn't been localized called Tokyo Mono Harashi. But it sounds like the rights to that have expired, so maybe that's no longer something that's being actively worked on. In a less concrete way, he's personally very interested in creating something that's based on film. But he's not quite sure what film he'd want to base it off just yet. Just kind of something that ties in with a movie would be nice.
There's such an influx and a desire in the marketplace for companion TTRPGs to games, absolutely, but also to films. You know, I think of Terminator and Aliens and Blade Runner, and the list goes on. People love to just disappear into their favorite worlds, and sometimes someone's favorite world is in a movie, and you get a lot less of that universe than you do with a 50-hour RPG, right? And so getting to explore that universe that you only really got to explore through a 2-hour movie is very fascinating to me as well. So we share that interest, as well as a Persona TTRPG. Tokita-san, you mentioned 3 and 4. I'm a huge fan of Persona 2. I would love to see a Persona 2 TTRPG come out at some point.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Simon.
Do you want me to translate that, or?
Sure.
Okay. やはりこう映画を元にその TRPG というのは重要があります。エイリアンだったり、ブレードランナーだったり、ターミネーターとか。やっぱりファンたちは自分の好きな世界にもっとなんていうか遊べる機会が欲しがっていて、で特に映画っていう話なんですけど、50時間かかるその RPG だったりと比べて映画2時間しかないので、やはりよりその世界が欲しいという人もいます。そしてブラドリーさんにとってはペルソナが大好きなので、ペルソナの TRPG ができたらなとすごく欲しがってるようです。
はい。 本当にペルソナは僕もやりたかったんですが、まあ、こればっかりは IP が取れないとどうしようもないんですね。
そうですね。
で、はい。エイリアン RPG はフリーリーグさんが作ってるのが非常に出来がいいので、これを超えるのはなかなか大変かなと思って、普通にプレイヤーをやっています。はい。そんな感じです。
So, I he would love to do Persona as a Persona fan himself, but with IP, the issue just comes down to rights. So maybe it's not the right time. That's just kind of a whole separate conversation. With regards to the Alien TRPG is fantastic. He really can't imagine anyone doing a better job of adapting that world. So as a player, he really just loves to enjoy that game.
It really is a fantastic system. Well, Tokita-san, we are at our time now. I want to thank you so much for taking 2 hours out of your day to answer my long, long list of questions, and I also want to thank you so much for helping get this project greenlit. Honestly, Tokita-san, without you, I don't think this project would have happened. It took so long just figuring out where the rights to this book ultimately laid. And there were so many people who were involved who were no longer in the industry or around anymore. And you really were so enthusiastic about getting this project across the finish line, that I truly believe that we would not be releasing this game right now if you were not as involved in getting the rights and figuring that out as you were. So I just want to thank you so much for that. Because we wouldn't be here right now without your passion and your belief in this project bringing this book to the West. So thank you.
長い時間いただきありがとうございます。本当に質問長くていっぱいありました。で、もう一つちょっと時田さんにすごく感謝してることは、本当におかげさまでこのゲームができたとすごく思ってます。やはりこれを海外版出したいとなった時は、誰がその権利を持ってるのかは本当に分からなくて、関わる人がもう業界からリタイアしてる場合もあって、でも時田さんがいて本当にこれを可能にする努力をしていただいたので、本当に今海外に英語版出せるからもう本当に感謝しています。
はい、こちらこそ感謝しています。これが刺激になって、日本でももう一度、メガテンの TRPG を出せるように、今頑張っていますが、頑張っていますが、ちょっとまだ結果が出ていないので、いずれ、いろんな形で、やっていきたい。本当にこの機会をいただいたことを非常にありがたく思います。Thank you for all. ありがとうございました。
で、最後にちょっとその音楽を流します。
Well, thank you so much. Takeda-san, Samuel, thank you for being a part of this conversation tonight. Hopefully you all have found it as enjoyable and informative as I have. I want to thank you for spending your last 2 hours with us. We are really excited about this project. We can't wait for release, and it'll be happening soon. So until next time, I'm Bradley Hailstorm. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.